Hello, and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In today's event, Dr. Kiran Bhardwaj will join us to talk about ethical issues that arise with new technologies, think managing data privacy, and how understanding our internal feelings of creepiness toward that new tech may actually help us find ways to introduce them without sacrificing ethics. But before we introduce Dr. Bhardwaj, I'll say a little bit more about our speaker series and how you can participate. So Ethically Speaking is organized by the UCF Center for Ethics with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beefer, who is Associate Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture and Founding Director of the Center for Ethics. We developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time, and we encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. And we'd also like to hear your feedback and your ideas for future talks in Ethically Speaking. Ethics connects to every facet of our professional and personal lives, and I like to say that the importance of ethics at UCF is, I hope, clear from the long list of inaugural partners who helped launch this series, and all of us in this partnership hope you really enjoy the discussions in Ethically Speaking. And we hope it cultivates some understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. So just to remind you, today's event, like others, is being recorded, and we will post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and also share it with others. Our speaker today is hosted by none other than Dr. Josh Kissel, who is a postdoctoral scholar with the UCF Center for Ethics, and he's going to be moderating our discussion as well. So at the end of the presentation, Dr. Bhardwaj will take questions moderated by Dr. Kissel, and you can submit your questions to them directly via chat to Dr. Kissel. And Dr. Bhardwaj also may be using chat. She'll tell you more about that during her presentation, so pay close attention. So now I'm going to stop the share of the slides, and I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Kissel to introduce our speaker. And thank you all for coming.
Great. Yeah. So first of all, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you especially to Dr. Bhardwaj. So Dr. Kiran Bhardwaj, she's chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Phillips Academy Andover, which is also where I happened to meet her. And so she teaches across philosophy there. Before that, she did a PhD in philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill. She's locally famous, and maybe now I'm in Florida, so that's farther. For her commitment to students, she teaches a bunch of great classes: feminist philosophy, blame and forgiveness, human nature, and so on. But her research interests are why she's here today. And so they cover areas of ethics, feminism, and a little bit, to my chagrin, Kant. But particularly of interest, I think, for all of us now is this work she's doing in philosophy of technology. And so she's going to draw on that expertise today. From 2019 to 2024, she had a Tang Fellowship at Andover, where she was working with folks in the computer science departments to develop a curriculum, an ethics-embedded curriculum in computer science for students. And it's, exactly this sort of ethics and technology expertise that we'll be having to speak about. I'll also say, beyond her excellence in research and in teaching, she's also a great, wonderful person. And so I can attest to that. And that's not something you'll see on her CV, perhaps. I guess if you look between the lines at what she researches, you'll see some of that. But I'm gonna turn over to her now. She's gonna do a great job. If you have questions, as Steve said, send them to me directly, and I'll select those questions and we'll share them with Kiran, just to organize for questions that overlap and so forth. And then if she says anything about you engaging with the chat during the talk, please do so. Thank you all. And with that, Kiran.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me, everyone. All right, let me start by sharing my screen. Can everyone see that well?
Looks great.
Great. And then maybe let me also make sure that I can see the chat as we go. Fabulous. Okay. So my talk today is called Creepy Privacy. Creepy Technology. And I found myself engaged in this project on creepiness actually by accident. It's a bit ironic because I actually get too scared to enjoy horror as a genre. But many of my favorite philosophical projects are all centered on the ordinary experiences of being a human. And there's nothing quite so human as being creeped out. So we all probably have a technology that creeps us out at least somewhat. And so one of the things that I was hoping you would do for me in the chat is to leave a note to me about what technology squicks you out the most. Squick is obviously a very technical term, similar to ick, but rather than simple distaste, it causes you proper discomfort or revulsion. Um, so my standard answer to this has been, while you tap in your answers, my standard answer for this has been Alexa and other smart home devices. Although now I think my intuitions are trading more towards the privacy nightmares that are modern cars, which track your and sell our data with very few limitations, and for most folks in the US at least, are not opt out. Okay, we've got a cosign on the smart home devices. Yeah, the feeling that devices like your phone is listening to you and recommending content, using AI to bring back people from the dead. Yeah, there are currently, so this was originally a Black Mirror episode, but now there are also contemporary companies that can try to capture the voice or the wording of a loved one. Targeted advertising, absolutely. Yeah, good. So one of the things that we know is that in a lot of discussion of technology, the focal question is this creepy, as if it's the same thing as ought we to do it, or is this a breach of privacy? And this is commonly how reporting on new technology is done, where the focal point becomes creepiness. So Mozilla does a lot of work actually in trying to do consumer advocacy about privacy protection. So they have this privacy not included list in which they scrutinize the privacy practices of a number of common things. On that list of creepy products and services from privacy not included is the Amazon Halo Band, which is a fitness tracker. And Amazon asks you to take pictures of yourself in your underwear so it can measure and track your body fat. Okay, so there are lots of things along these lines that really catch our attention. But you also might be wondering, well, let's think more about creepiness. Creepiness is not a perfect proxy for something, whether or not something is a breach of privacy. After all, once we look closer, we can spot both false negatives and false positives. False negatives where something doesn't elicit a feeling of creepiness, but is indeed a breach of privacy. So, for example, when we don't know that privacy breaching activities are going on in the first place, such as surveillance or manipulation, or false positives. New technologies often appear concerning at first, and then later we decide that they're benign or even beneficial. So I don't know about you all, but my parents' standard advice for when I was young is don't meet with strangers from the internet and never get into cars driven by strangers. And now all of us who use ride-sharing services regularly do both. But because we've made creepiness such a central focus of our attention, a lot of technologists have actually focused on altering user perceptions of creepiness rather than interrogating whether the underlying practices preserve privacy. So Eric Schmidt, Google's former CEO, famously said when he was running the company that Google policy is to get right up to the creepy line and not cross it. One of the famous stories around this, it's probably apocryphal, but it goes something along the lines of it's about targeted advertising, where they can pinpoint, and this I believe is genuinely true, they can pinpoint when a person is pregnant by their purchasing decisions. And that part, it seems right. There are a number of data brokers that offer information on people who are pegged as either actively pregnant or shopping for maternity products. The probably apocryphal part of the story, even though this was reported in the New York Times Magazine in 2012, and so it's gotten a lot of credence as a result, is a story about a father of a teenage daughter coming in angry because Target had started sending congratulations coupons for baby gear to the customers that they had pegged as pregnant or likely pregnant. And then later, the same father comes in and is abashed because it turns out that Target was right. His teenage daughter was in fact pregnant. So the story in this New York Times magazine article goes that now once advertisers realize that that customers found this targeted advertising creepy, they embedded the coupons for baby gear, which was their preference, within a set of advertisements, so it doesn't garner such a creepy reaction. So we can see this kind of behavior making sense, where in order to avoid perceptions of creepiness, We just do the same thing, but change the way in which it looks. And because of that, we might think that our focus on creepiness is actively a problem. It serves as a red herring when we should be concerned with foundational concerns about privacy. So as I think we can notice, creepiness is an imperfect or flawed proxy for whether a technology or practice breaches our privacy. And technologists work to minimize users' feelings of creepiness is a palliative approach rather than a curative approach. It's like treating pain alone rather than determining whether that pain is benign or temporary, or if there's some root cause which really ought to be addressed. So legal scholar Neil Richards says, against creepiness, thinking about privacy in terms of creepiness is not only a bad way of gauging whether there's a real privacy issue, it also confuses us about what's really at stake, and it further enables the exercise of power by those who control our data. What I'm going to do in this talk, though, is to say that we deserve two things before we fully give up on creepiness being useful to us. First, I think we need a well-developed analysis of the phenomenon of creepiness. And then I think we need a clearer view of how and in what ways creepiness should or should not serve as a guide to indicate that something is going wrong ethically. So this talk will fall into two halves. In part one, we're going to define creepiness, and in part two, we're going to focus on creepiness and technology. All right, onwards, team. Part one, defining creepiness, there will be three parts. First, I would like to define creepiness in general, and then we'll talk about the work of the emotions more generally, and then talk about this thing that I would like to call moral creepiness. Okay. So what exactly is creepiness? One of the tasks that we really love in philosophy is definition building. So where possible, we're trying to come up with a definition that covers all and only cases of the things that we're interested in defining. So why don't, again, we take the chat, if you would, to add as many diverse examples of creepy things or behaviors or persons or experiences or contexts as possible. So if you wouldn't mind putting some other ideas into the chat, we've already got our list of creepy technology, which is a great thing. And then we can have more. So creepy crawly bugs come to mind. A cabin in the woods with no one around comes to mind. That creepy person that you encountered the other day, perhaps. So we can try to get as expansive of a list as possible. I see on the chat, stalking. Definitely, definitely. There might be some other things that we could add to this list. Ooh, yes, hearing footsteps behind you when you are walking alone at night. People staring too long. Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And so one of the things that we want to think about is what's in common between the items on those lists that we could make. Now, one thing, déjà vu. Ooh, that's a good one. Now, one of the things that we might capture in some of these cases is there's some kind of aversive reaction, fear-like or disgust-like, that's in play. But then there's also uncertainty. So when I think of creepy crawly bugs, for example, I have something aversive going on, and then there's an uncertainty about whether or not they're going to crawl over towards me and whether or not they're a genuine threat or something along those lines. So, and this is important because if you know that something certainly merits feelings of fear or disgust, then creepiness just collapses into fear or disgust. This is a point from Sarah Bernstein and Daniel Nolan, who have a great account of creepiness out there. So wondering if somebody is following you home is creepy. Knowing that there's someone following behind you with malintent is fearful. Good, perfect. So we know that creepiness is this aversive reaction, disgust, fear, some combination of both, and uncertainty. Again, this is a definition that I'm sourcing from Sarah Bernstein and Daniel Nolan. And then we might be able to articulate some instances of the creeps that are more fear-like and instances of the creeps that are more disgust-like. Good. This, I think, is a good base definition that we're getting from Bernstein and Nolan. But I think we need some further modification. Creepiness isn't just going to be an aversive response combined with uncertainty, because There are all sorts of counterexamples against that base definition. A tornado warning prompts fear and uncertainty together, but it doesn't elicit creepiness. Instead, it might elicit something more like nervousness or anxiety. This is a point from Jeremy Fisher and Rachel Fredericks, another set of authors in this literature. Or we could have disgust and uncertainty together. For example, wondering if somebody has peed in the pool. So my preferred base definition of creepiness is that what matters for creepiness is agential threat. So that agent might be human or not, as in the instance of creepy crawly bugs. And I think that environments can trigger creepiness reactions if we're scanning them for agential threat. But I think this is what's going on when we're pinning down something is creepy at its base. So hopefully as you go through your own examples of what comes to mind when you think of creepiness, this generally captures your intuitions there. One of the things that I think is really important to notice about creepiness then is it's not fear and it's not disgust. It's doing something different because there are two levels of vulnerability at play. The fear and or disgust component is tracking one part of our vulnerability. If it's something more fearful towards things that can harm us, if it's something that's more disgust-like, it's to physical or social contagion. But the uncertainty characteristic of the creeps is an indication of second order vulnerability. Because sometimes, and I think this is really important to notice, that uncertainty can make things worse. So to take a silly, but I think analogous example. So as a kid, it was deeply unpleasant when you did not know whether or not you were going to get in trouble. And that learning that you in fact are in trouble can be somewhat of a relief by comparison. The second order vulnerability of the creeps is in how taxing it is, where you constantly have to evaluate and reevaluate and reevaluate. There's this cognitive load where you can't decide on the next step. So this is going to be one of the central claims from my account of creepiness. In what follows, I'm going to unpack two further claims about creepiness. First, about what creepiness does for us via a larger story about what emotional in general does for us. And secondly, defining what I'm going to call moral creepiness. I think there's actually something really distinctive in play. That's our primary concern when we call something creepy in most moral contexts. Okay. Next order of business, what does emotion do for us? So what prompted this analysis of creepiness was this intuition that creepiness isn't a perfect proxy for whether or not something is a breach of privacy. But then you have folks like Richards who say that the emotion of creepiness distracts us away from what we ought to attend to. And I'm going to actually argue that that's not the case either. So to clarify my view, I think it's important for us to consider the uses and limits of the emotions in general. So the traditional story of emotion is that it gets in our way, that in fact emotion can be a threat to rationality. So for one common example of a story of this kind, think about the famous fear is the mind killer mantra from Dune, in which Paul Atreides is trying to not let his fear, his emotions sway him away from being his most rational self. And that's a very common theory of emotion, that emotion is in competition to rationality, but I think it's wrong. Instead, I favor a different kind of story about emotion, that emotions can be actually an epistemic asset and help us track reasons. So here I'm going to offer you a perceptualist account of the emotions. I particularly like the work of Christine Tapelet, who offers a perceptualist view of the emotions in her body of work. Perceptualist theories broadly argue that emotions are in many ways analogous to perceptual experiences. So like perceptions, emotions are A, automatically triggered by an experience in the world, and B, have correctness conditions. So to take this with an example of perception, when I see a lilac, I have this phenomenal and automatic experience of a light purple color that's prompted by my eye's proximity to the flower under the appropriate lighting conditions. But there are also correctness conditions to my perception. If I was looking under low light or had some variety of color blindness or was confused by the tinting of my sunglasses, I might wrongly perceive the color of the flower. And analogously, Tapelet says, emotions are also A, automatically triggered by an experience in the world, and B, have correctness conditions. If I feel disgust, for example, there's a phenomenal experience of that disgust that is automatically triggered by an experience in the world, perhaps stepping in dog poo, or even imagining stepping in dog poo. We don't decide to, and certainly don't want to experience disgust. It's not a pleasant emotion. It just automatically results. Um, there are similarly correctness conditions for disgust responses. A person who refuses to eat a delicious chocolate turtle because it looks to them like a piece of poo is not having a disgust reaction that's appropriate to the item in question. Emotions track the world and as such can be epistemic touchstones for us. They give us ways of knowing. So consider the case of fear. In a situation where fear is warranted, perhaps we are being followed. The response of fear might facilitate action thanks to its automatic activation of bodily system and to narrow our focus of attention. In short, our fear can be reasons responsive and actually might give us good information about what's happening before we have a chance to rationally process what's going on around us. But because we need to confirm correctness conditions, emotions are just subject, like perceptions, to critical scrutiny and reflective endorsement. So, for example, a baseline disgust about poo shouldn't constrain us from changing our baby's diaper or picking up our dog's poo on a walk, so long as we add on other measures to do so as hygienically as possible. And we can train our emotions so that we no longer have or greatly lessen the force of disgust in those kinds of cases, or otherwise correct for sources of error from our emotions. So I think that creepiness, like the other emotions, can be an important epistemic touchstone as well. As Fisher and Fredericks argue, the creeps can be helpful as an early warning system. With the perceptualist theory of emotion on hand, I think we can understand why creepiness is not merely a distraction. I think it's in fact an asset that helps us detect and respond to those two levels of possible vulnerability. We just need to simply not forget about the importance of doing our due diligence. All right, onwards to moral creepiness. So what I'd like to do in this part of my presentation is to suggest that there's in fact a paradigmatic form of creepiness in moral life when the aversive reaction in question is directed towards a target that ambiguously exhibits or we believe poses a risk of wrongfully dominating behaviors towards ourselves or others. Of course, the natural question at this point is, what exactly is domination? So this is the quick answer that I'd like to put in front of you for today, which is that the term tracks unjust or inappropriate constraints on self-determination, where self-determination is a fundamental good in our lives that allows us to choose our own actions or the conditions for our actions on matters of central human value. So there have been plenty of folks who work on this particular topic. Philosopher Marie Mikola argues that these values include things like the absence of groundless anxieties and resentments, the capacity to engage in meaningful social intercourse, a certain amount of freedom from interference and coercion. All of these are central human values. And there's, of course, a longer list, a potentially much longer list. But let's leave it at that for now. The morally creepy person or creepy institution, norm, practice, whatever, prompts us, I think, to ask if there is a threat to their target's appropriate sphere of self-determination. So that note that in what I'll discuss coming up, because creepiness also involves an uncertainty component, a clean analysis of whether or not there's domination in play will sometimes collapse an initial feeling of creepiness into something else, genuine fear or disgust or perhaps anger, or their absence, depending on whether there was no domination in play. So with moral creepiness, I think, we'll have cases such as other people or groups directly constraining other people's self-determination. And again, there has to be some element of ambiguity or uncertainty in play. For example, we sometimes perceive romantic or other relationships as creepy because we're wondering if one party is making decisions or unduly influencing choices that should have legitimately been the other person's decision. We will often have uncertainties in play because of legitimate variations in how relationships are conducted, or whether there's more to know than what third parties can witness. But this seems to be getting at what I'm interested in with moral creepiness. Structural domination, I think, is also a factor here. It can be imposed by a more complicated interface of institutions, social practices, as well as the actions of individual agents. So institutions and other non-agential elements of our social world, like policies and practices, can be creepy because they wield or promote unjust or inappropriate patterns of agential power, or at least we worry that they do. So for example, we might think that the NSA is creepy as an institution, even though we don't quite know what they're doing. Or think that a workplace policy to use GPS to track employee locations without a clear rationale to do so is also creepy. But I think it's also important to understand the ways in which a member of a socially dominant group can wield social power over members of a socially dominated group in order to understand the claims that we make about creepiness. So a man staring at a woman in public is perceived as creepy, not due solely to his behavior alone, but also because of the social background of gendered oppression. Experiences of moral creepiness regularly come about for those who experience oppression, given how oppression coexists with domination. So members of oppressed groups are put into many positions of uncertainty about agential threats, to ask if this behavior or system is one of the many intended to constrain their choices due to their social identity or identities, or if they're certain that it is, and are uncertain about how further actions on their or others' parts will play out. To take a case study, we could imagine an older man who is touching the shoulders of younger women more frequently and of a longer duration than he does so for anyone else. And in those kinds of cases, the person who's being touched might have a more fear-like response of, is this going to escalate? Am I going to be safe? Is this intended to be innocuous? Is this intended to be something else? If I am to say something, am I going to get social pushback? So there might be all sorts of questions that are in play about how further actions on their or others' parts will play out. Even if we're certain about there being an action of domination in play, there might be further uncertainties about other actions. So I think it's important to note here that one of the common features of oppression is an expectation of violence or other harms because of one's membership in a particular social group. And so I suspect that creepiness makes extra sense as an effective response because of that fact. An outward expression of disgust or fear might feel like it could put us in danger in one way, shape, or form. And creepiness as a modified or moderated version of disgust or fear, I think allows us to better protect ourselves without giving away the same facial or bodily cues and thereby provoking further bad behavior or violence. And we should also acknowledge how creepiness is weaponized against members of marginalized groups. So in particular, feelings of creepiness are regularly and wrongly directed towards those with various kinds of disabilities or physical disfigurement, members of the LGBTQ+ community, those who are neurodivergent, and so on. And in those kinds of cases, our priming to regard differences as dangerous and social and political claims that inflame those priming, those kinds of priming, cause an ambiguous version of fear and or disgust. However, as in the perceptualist story, we should be prepared to evaluate moral creepiness to see if it's met its correctness conditions. Like anything else, there could be false negatives or false positives. False negatives, could it happen, for example, imagine somebody pitting a sexual harasser because they just don't understand the social cues that the other person isn't romantically or sexually interested in them. And often the person making a false negative claim doesn't feel fear in those kinds of circumstance, maybe because they're unused to or are unsympathetic about threats from those making romantic bids for attention. And perhaps they don't feel disgust, perhaps because they think there was an excuse in play, even when there is good reason to think that there was not. So we have to be very mindful of how our identities can allow us to fail to recognize a kind of wrongful domination in play. If we're unfamiliar with how a certain set of social behaviors or practices plays out, or if we haven't done our epistemic due diligence in the first place, we might be more likely to wrongfully dismiss an agential threat. We could also have false positives, I think, in this domain. The example that comes to my mind is a father who's at the playground with his child could be wrongly labeled as creepy because of the ways in which our oppressive structures around gender harm men as well as women. We do have cases of possible or ambiguous stories of possible or ambiguous danger that are mistakenly attributed to a benign case. So with moral creepiness as well, critical scrutiny and reflective endorsement, as well as a good story of domination on hand, I think are really important. Okay, so that's the first part of the talk. Onward to technology. So I've given you an analysis of creepiness in general and moral creepiness in particular. So I think the name of the game is, at this point, what should we say about creepy technology? Now, I think we need to start by not dismissing creepiness. This sometimes comes from, again, folks who I consider largely allies in thinking about what we should be doing with regards to technology, like advocates of informational privacy like Neil Richards, who are rightly focusing on how creepiness might distract away from the real question about whether digital technologies are adequately protecting the privacy of those whose information they collect. So while I am genuinely sympathetic to this reasoning, I think a primary obligation of technology companies should be how do we meet our obligation to protect users, and certainly should not be focused on managing their reactions of creepiness. However, I disagree with Richard's thought that creepiness is a mere distraction. Not only do you already know that I think that emotions can be an asset, although, again, they require critical scrutiny. I think a good definition of creepiness can actually help us elucidate what we're looking for in ethical technology. So, in my account of creepiness, I offered a few major claims, and I'd like to focus in on how the second and third of these can help us in particular. Again, these are that there are two types of reasons that creepiness can help us track. One is the first level of vulnerability to agential threat, and the second level of vulnerability due to ambiguity in play. And then I think that we also need an additional account of moral creepiness, in which the first level threat in question is an agent or set of agents who may be aiming to engage in practices of wrongful domination. Okay, so let's go talk next about a different kind of dismissal of creepiness, the one from proponents of digital technologies who claim that creeped out consumers are being overly sensitive or don't understand the technology well enough. So I'd argue that those in positions of control over digital technologies have obligations to meet regardless of whether the consumers are correct or not that a digital technology poses a threat to them. So remember, again, there's two levels of threat. Even if we conclude that a particular technology doesn't pose a risk of a breach of privacy or a similar agential threat, I think it would still be wrong to conclude that this is a place in which emotion has steered us wrong due to a false positive. Perhaps proponents of a digital technology are absolutely right that there is no agential threat from a particular technological design or practice. However, I do think that the positionality of those who build technologies mean that they cannot actually evaluate these claims well on their own. They actually need external advisors in order to be able to do so. Happy to answer more about that in Q&A if you'd like. But I do think there's going to be this second level of vulnerability in play in which there was a true positive, that of ambiguity and uncertainty. If users of a digital technology experience feelings of creepiness about it, there's this additional obligation to do what's needed to address that second level of vulnerability in ways that respect their agency, particularly for users who are not knowledgeable about technology, who have limited bandwidth, or who are especially vulnerable. Then I think we also need to talk about domination that's done via technology. So I think the theory of moral creepiness helps us articulate our central concern about certain technologies or technological practices. We're concerned with self-determination, particularly on matters of central human interest. So there were all of these items from Nicola's list that are matters of central human interest. And all of these, I think, are plausibly under threat by the various ways in which contemporary technologies have been designed. We can be dominated in both obvious and subtle ways. So for the obvious, consumers are regularly subject to coerced choices when technology companies have monopoly or near monopoly power. For example, even if I chose not to use Gmail myself in favor of a more privacy-oriented email provider, I'm still likely to want to be able to email friends, family, and others who do use Gmail themselves, allowing Google as a company access to what I have to say. Or we could recognize, as Daniel Sasser, Beate Rössler, and Helen Nissenbaum explained in their paper Online Manipulation, the ways in which we experience technology facilitates manipulation, which itself subverts our capacity for self-determination without us even recognizing that has happened. So Susser and his co-authors argue that information technology facilitates manipulation because it allows for fine-grained micro-targeting due to the combination of, first of all, how much digital surveillance we are subject to. Second, how precisely designed choice architectures can be crafted and deployed for each individual visitor. And third, how these tools mediate our experience. That is, we don't regularly focus on the technologies themselves, but we use them as a lens for other tasks without notice of the tool. So for example, when we go to search for an answer online, we're usually not asking ourselves how those Google results have been populated or the quality of that search. There are also subtler threats of domination as well. So Richards also writes about the problematic American practice of notice and choice privacy policies, which so look like they're doing right by consumers by informing us about how our data will be used and asking us to consent. But because of the majority of us do not have a law degree or the hours or days of effort that it would require to read each policy carefully and in full, we simply click to agree as if we've genuinely consented. This makes it look like this makes it possible for technology companies to present themselves as having met their obligations to protect user privacy without genuinely having done so. Notice and choice policies in themselves constrain our self-determination by exhausting us by making too many choices, rather than reserving our energies of choice making for what matters most to us. So in order to avoid threats of domination in digital contexts, we need to protect the self-determination of individuals in matters of central human interest, and also protect and preserve their choice making for what matters most. Technology companies have an obligation, I think, to engage in practices of design that can allow users to meaningfully make decisions for themselves. So imagine what it would be like, for example, to be able to select privacy profiles on browsers or as a chosen default on one's phone or tablet. Similar to maybe how we all thought that incognito mode worked once upon a time. Those who are very comfortable with targeted advertising, for example, and who appreciate receiving advertisements that are tailored to their interests and needs could have one kind of profile. Those who are very much not, such as those who have escaped past abusers, those who might be subject to political repression, or simply are less comfortable with their information being shared, could be much more protected as they proceed without needing deep technological expertise or to make a million choices in order to safeguard their information. As a final note, let's go back to the practice from that Target story of minimizing users' perceptions of creepiness that has been the common way for companies to fix their creepiness problem. On a more careful study, I think we can see that that practice is in and of itself a practice of domination. It's a workaround that fails to treat consumers as having an appropriate sphere of self-determination on matters of central human interest, and instead obscure what might have mattered to users had they known about it. And that, I think, is what a good theory of creepiness can allow us to articulate. All right, thank you. And let's have some conversation from here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Alex is actually going to start with a question relating to technology as a neutral medium, if that's cool, Alex.
Thank you for the talk. This was really interesting. I didn't even know this was a conversation that was being had, so it's just fascinating to hear all these takes. My question has to do with technology as a medium and thinking about the agency of people who use it, right? So it was interesting to me because, you know, we started the conversation on the chat, like what is creepy, and you know, you can think about technology being creepy, but you also think about, okay, this person following me or something like that, right? So technology kind of adds a layer to the creepiness of an agent. So it makes me think about cases where we might welcome the use of this technology, such as people who put a bunch of cameras in their home and they know they're being surveilled and they don't care. Or even, you know, people who are inadvertently surveilled by the Ring doorbell of their neighbors, but whatever, you know, like their neighbors have the right to feel secure in their house. But then you also have, you know, the government that can use these technologies and satellite to track you without you knowing, or, you know, to, I don't know, take a picture of your house and see that you built illegally a pool and send you a fine or whatever, you know, things of that nature. So I'm wondering, to the extent that technology could be or could have been used in the past, even when it was not so adept at surveillance, to facilitate creepy behaviors, right? Like, it's, I don't know, easier to stalk someone if you have night vision goggles than if you don't, or that's kind of maybe a dumb example, but that's what came to mind. Could we think of technology that allows more in-depth surveillance as a medium that can also, you know, perhaps not be associated with creepiness, but the creepiness kind of attaches to the intentionality of what different people are using it, because it could actually serve good purposes rather than just selling ads for Google or, you know, whatever that may be. So yeah, I'm just throwing that out there to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's a good set of questions, especially since there are, one of the things that interests me in this collection of thoughts that you've been throwing out is, like, again, we do have folks with more tolerance, or who really welcome certain kinds of technology, again, like maybe as means of security or to secure other kinds of goods, convenience, for one. So I think there are a few things that are in play. One is that I worry about something like privacy being put into tension with other goods, right? So I actually started working on this project when I was sitting in a computer science teachers conference, and there was a presentation going on about teaching students to think about whether a technology is creepy or convenient. And first of all, I was like, that binary doesn't feel good to me. And second of all, I think it allows us to more artificially focus on when we would be willing to give up privacy and other goods like self-determination, when we should instead think about the ways in which privacy can actually facilitate things that are even more central. We can't, I think, have a good sense of security without privacy. I don't think we can. I don't think that convenience is choice worthy over something along the lines of privacy. And the second thing that I wanted to say is about the sort of different tolerances and the ways in which in many of our cases, we are asked to make data decisions that hit the lowest common denominator in terms of privacy. So one of the ways in which our data is tracked is if my profile, for example, as a consumer is not based upon solely me, but also other people using my Wi-Fi. And because of that, if you're living in a household with somebody who's more tolerant and somebody who's less tolerant of being surveilled in various kinds of ways, I think there's like something that really needs to be negotiated there. But rather than allowing going to the lowest common denominator in a certain equation, I think you have to go to the highest common denominator. How do we maximally protect folks in a particular equation? And so that's one of the things that I think is really important, especially since I do think that we should be really wary of wrongful domination in these kinds of contexts.
Sorry, can I ask a really quick follow-up, Josh, if that's okay with you?
Permission granted.
Thank you. So your response was excellent, and I think it points to these really good tensions that are there, especially when thinking about this kind of as a social, something impacting us socially. I was wondering if you can comment, in addition to that, to the role that, and because you're bringing domination, I think that's also relevant, the role that this technology plays within a capitalist system, with a certain business model that makes it so these invasions in privacy are, front and forward, right? Because I can, again, like thinking in this comfort of people, okay, maybe if I could, buy that product, just use it. It's not like I'm selling my data. It's not like anyone can access it. Maybe there's safeguards. Of course, there's always the possibility of hacking, things like that. But if that is the case, and the business model is a big part of the problem, does changing the business model automatically remove that element of creepiness, perhaps, or is it not? Is it something more inherent within the technology?
Right. I think I think there are different avenues of approach. One of them I think has to be regulation, government regulation, in order to secure an architecture in which and certain business models are competitive against the let me vacuum up every little bit of information that's possible. So I do think that's part of my story. But I think even internally within the work of a business, I think there are lots of interesting things that can be done. So, for example, Sasha Costanza Chalk has an account of participatory design and the ways in which folks who are often not in the room when big decisions are being made that impact them, can be brought into a design process early and well in a way that could shape the design of a technology. And I think that's really important as a business, like as a practice of a company that wants to do this work well. So I think yes and is where I would go with that. Both avenue of approach from the work of particular technologists, as well as I do think there has to be some regulation as well to govern privacy concerns as well as other related concerns. Manipulation, I think, is just as concerning for domination in technology as privacy is.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't. Actually, the follow-up question, it's kind of related to this question of regulation and a possible tension between that and censorship, both deepfake technology. Denise Garcia, are you happy to still share this yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So, when thinking about like creepiness and technology, what comes to my mind is deepfake technology. And from what I've seen about this issue, it can be especially harmful to women and children. And since obviously like this is an issue of legality, it may or may not like require government regulation. And if like this did come about, do you think like this could lead to an issue of censorship since not all deepfake technology is used in a harmful way,
Mm.
and policies may or may not affect those things too?
Mm. Yeah, I haven't spent as much time thinking about deepfakes, although there are some philosophers who have started to read who do. I think Regina Rini has something nice on this particular topic. One of the things that I mean, I think how do I want to put this? I really do appreciate the concern about censorship because often it's going to be folks who are whose voices can and should be heard who are going to be censored. I suspect I would be more inclined to think about a policy that requires something along the lines of making deepfakes much more obvious that they are what they are, because I think there are various kinds of cues that even for current deepfake technology that some folks can recognize that other folks are not, and that's actually pretty pernicious. And so some kind of methodology for being able to recognize that if any deepfakes are allowed to persist. But I don't know if I have a beautiful answer here, mostly because I haven't thought about it quite as much. But I do think that in terms of the majority of deepfake uses, which are for like more pornographic reasons, I'm deeply concerned about those because of precisely the ways in which they're used for women and other people who are vulnerable parties. And so I think that there should be at least some regulation on like the side of what kinds of images are permitted to be used or generated with deepfake technology is maybe the starting point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Katya, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, hi, thank you so much. It's very nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is about the cookies. So whenever, for example, I do some research and one click on one of those, and if it's popping up that this site follow some cookies, I just stop it. I don't go over there. So it's kind of really my fear. So is there any, because sometimes you have to go, so I have to just accept those cookies because it's something that other than that, to go into that site, you cannot give your information. For example, for regarding the airline, sometimes you have to go to this one. So is there any like a regulation on this one, and how I try to understand this one, and lots of research on it. So sometimes just want to regarding the follow what you're doing in the future, they put everything that you just search and it's like a engine search, so something like that. But sometimes I don't know what's going on. So can you explain some regarding this one? Thank you.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that this is a parallel problem to the fact that there are that this has become so normalized that there have become very few paths to, or like again, it's a huge lift to be able to conduct an ordinary life in which our data isn't being hoovered up. I think that's genuinely a problem. And so one of the things that I think needs to happen is, again, a way to make things quite easy for folks to, without having to like toggle a button a million times or to refuse to go into down certain pathways that would not allow them to access things. So again, like the Mozilla analysis of of cars, for example, is interesting because there are no car manufacturers who are designing cars right now that have data privacy policies that are worth liking. And so if you need a new car, you're in trouble. I think that should be unacceptable. I think that there should be always like a pathway in order to conduct ordinary business of life in which we do not need to, we aren't going to be tracked and targeted, at least tracked and targeted in the micro-targeted way that is part of contemporary experience. So that's where my particular concerns are. I think broadband sorts of advertisements feel and look different than narrowband advertisements. And we should be wary about those in the same kinds of ways.
Thank you.
Steve, you had a question about related to regulation and the future.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the talk. It was really great and lots of insight there. I'm enjoying the insight from the questions too. I'm not sure my question is going to offer a lot of insight, but several times I've heard you and maybe in the questions that we need more regulation. But when I look across the current landscape, I'm seeing that we're entering a time of maybe decreasing government regulations. So what are some other answers? How does the non-government public or the private sector actually play the role where you might evoke regulations, giving that I think we need another answer?
Yeah. No, this is one of the reasons why my answers have been largely directed towards an ethically oriented technologist in some ways. Because I do think that there are folks out there who are thinking about how to do well ethically in the conduct of their technology development. I think otherwise, I do think that government regulation would be the ideal answer. I actually find it's quite interesting that we don't see that kind of limitation can be seen as a kind of competitive mechanism similar to the other like competitive mechanisms that folks like in market systems. So that always strikes me as odd that we don't see things like regulations that are that are consumer protections as on the same model and method as we see other kinds of competition. But that's a side note. I think otherwise we are sort of reliant upon collective action practices. And that's where that's where we have to go if governments and companies aren't going to do their due diligence.
Thank you.
Great. I'm going to take a prerogative of the moderator and ask a question. So it's not as explicitly tied to technology as such, but so the concern that you talked about at various points, right? About how there can be sort of an irrationality to our senses of creepiness or our fear and disgust. And so I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, like how you respond to that objection, right? So you mentioned explicitly how, you know, often people have fear and disgust towards people who are different or unfamiliar from them in ways that are objectionable and wrong. And so I get that, yeah, okay, we identify the objectionable and wrong. But is there more you can say about like the ways we can avoid that or the limits we can put on ourselves, especially if we're doing this individually, to prevent that misfiring?
Yeah, good. So with regards to differences, this is where I think a lot of the traditional principles of philosophical thinking are really helpful. We engage in principles of the principle of charity. We engage in intellectual humility. We do the things that we need to do to check our work. And most important, I think the touchstone should be, are we engaging in thought processes or behaviors that are dehumanizing other people? Because that's usually, I think, the signal fire that something has gone really badly wrong in the ways in which we are engaging in creepiness. So if we are no longer treating a person as a person, or if we're treating them as less than human in some way, I think that is a danger sign. And I think all of us can be susceptible to this. We do this with our political opponents. We do this with people who are badly behaved in lots of ways. And I also think that we do it with regards to other absolutely benign differences between people, but that are just different from the ways in which we practice and conduct our lives. And that is what I'm usually looking out for.
Good. Yeah, that's helpful. It makes sense. I guess I had a related question, not me, sorry, there was a related question that came in, this rationality idea, and it connects to this question of like when might we need like, oh sorry, I want to rephrase it correctly so it comes through. Should we be measuring and controlling for irrationality of creepiness, especially when maybe it's in tension with other things we might care about or need to care about, like security and so forth? And like, so your answer there was on an individual basis, maybe on this more like institutional basis, when it feels like this irrationality causes problems for, I don't know, something like security.
Yeah, good. So here I'm going to go ahead and recommend Neil Richards' book. It's a lovely book, Why Privacy Matters, because one of the things that he's doing there, I sort of alluded to this in my first answer, but I didn't quite get the full story out. One of the thoughts there is, I think many other folks take privacy as an intrinsic good. It is good in and of itself. But if you don't, I think his argument's really compelling, because what he has to say is we're going to go down the wrong path if we don't also see how privacy can be a really important instrumental good to other things that are of central human importance. And he articulates that argument really nicely in his book. So this is perhaps not answering the question in the way that was intended, but I think it's the way that's worth answering it, which is, rather than thinking of good versus good, we should really focus in on what privacy and other considerations, like avoiding manipulation, can really secure for us instrumentally. And I think those are many of the central human goods that we want.
Yeah. Yeah, Steve, did you want to follow up more on that? I like your answer, but it wasn't originally my question, so. Otherwise, we're open, the stack is open for other questions, and so repeat questions are welcome now at this point.
Yeah, no, I maybe just a follow up as I was thinking about, we were thinking parallel questions, Josh, and as I was penning mine, I did have initially a juxtaposition of maybe creepiness and personal privacy, personal needs versus societal. And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, you know, creepiness wins. We've got to protect the person. But maybe people could say it feels creepy to take a vaccine. You know, I don't want that in my body. That's creepy. And
Hmm.
so some would say, oh, no, 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 we need herd immunity. You got to take the vaccine. So it kind of, in some ways, maybe makes me think about how individuals would come down on one issue, and it just comes back to personal values. Even
Mm.
when people think about the societal norms, their personal values really inform strongly what they think those societal norms should be. And so in those two issues, data privacy versus vaccination, you know, logically thinking individuals could fall on very different viewpoints of whether creepiness wins or societal needs wins. I don't know if you can comment maybe more eruditely about that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So one of my thoughts here is that well, I absolutely think that the emotions can be assets for us. Um, one of the things that I always wonder is like, have we always done our epistemic due diligence, or are we just solely relying on those emotions? And one of the things that I would think would be the next step of the question that we should be asking is, have we done the work um, of of doing our due diligence on data privacy or vaccines? And I think in some cases people have, but in many other cases, there's so many choices that we have to make in our lives that we are not. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why we should be able to trust folks who are in positions of epistemic authority compared to us. Talking about, for example, like the many good reasons why we should be like, we should think that unless we have like one of a very few sets of medical exceptions, that we could take a well-tested vaccine like MMR. I think that's one of the things that is interesting in those cases, that sometimes we allow our feelings of like disgust or fear to like throw us in our decision making in cases where we shouldn't. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm like, we do need to do the work. We do need to do the work. In this particular case, I think because of the ways in which digital surveillance and digital manipulation is conducted, we don't see anything except some sometimes surface level materials that are involved in there. And so I think there we're more likely to have false negative responses rather than false positives. But I think underlying it all should be this question of how do we look out for cases of self-determination.
If I can tug on that thread a little bit more,
Please.
I found myself thinking about this question in terms of isolated issues. You know, what is the situation? What is causing me to feel creepiness? What gives me anxiety about, you know, loss of agency with regard to accepting the requirements of this piece of software or whatever. But I wonder if some of the tensions that we, you know, have experienced over the last so many years in US society are really about isolated instances as opposed to cumulative loss of agency or feelings of cumulative loss of agency. And so that when a situation arises, it's about not just lacking good epistemic understanding of that single issue, but feeling like enough is enough. I'm going to put my foot down, not putting anything in my body because we're so, I guess, weighted by the loss of agency that we have in an increasingly technological society. Is there anything there, or am I too
Yeah.
much of an apologist?
No, I do actually co-sign co-sign that. And one of the things that I think can make for a really good leadership is like an ability to reflect back the genuine concerns and understandings of folks who are being governed or being led by decisions that a person in a position of power is making. And when I think that is absent is one of the reasons why, I mean, even on a small scale, much less like the massive scale that's involved in political governance. I think that's one of the reasons why people don't do as well with taking on board collective action cues from positions of leadership. And so that's one of the things that I really wish that we could do better.
That's nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alex, did you saw something on this thread? You want to jump in?
Yes, unless there's someone else who has a new question. But okay, just a quick follow-up again on this question about the tension between privacy and security.
Yeah, good.
And it's related, I guess, to the point that you mentioned about privacy as an intrinsic good. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea that privacy is both intrinsic and instrumentally good, I guess. But I'm also wondering the extent to which it might be coming into tension with other valuable goods, such as community cohesion. You know, many people will make that argument, for instance, and how this increasing privatization of life makes us want to share less and less and less with people. So we're kind of, you know, almost assuming that there's certain fundamental goods about being human that are related to privacy, but that are themselves, you know, very, I guess, ontologically contingent, right? Depending on how we think about what it means to be human and what values we have and things of that sort. So I wonder if there's a challenge to that assumption, right? That ontological assumption, perhaps. What does that mean for the way we think about technological, you know, innovations that infringe on privacy, especially if you remove, again, the element of malicious actors, you know, using it to harm you. Like just the fact that people might know more things about you, right? And everything about your life, like it could be even without technology or something like that. How does that complicate the question?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I've been thinking quite a bit about like how we want to think about ourselves as agents. So obviously I think that individual like self-determination is going to be a big part of the story, but I also think that our agency is community like constituted. I can make sense of who I am by the kinds of conversations that I have with other people around me, by the communities that I live in and that I identify with. And so one of the things that I think is going to be involved is how do we preserve each person's sphere of self-determination? And sometimes that is going to involve privacy. And sometimes that's going to involve not having privacy, like having my buddy Josh come in and be like, hey, you're really like being reclusive right now. Are you okay? And checking up for like an aspect of my well-being that might actually be preventing me from being able to exercise self-determination, because those kinds of things come up. So I don't think that we should go for a more individualistic set of norms about agency and self-determination. I do think that we also have to temper this with the fact that we are constituted by our communities. So I think maybe where I'm going with this is I love a good story about privacy. I don't think it's the only game in town. And in many ways, I think that privacy is pointing towards something else that we want, which is this kind of self-determination and other core goods that are involved in practicing our agency well.
So I have a question and a really quick follow-up again, Josh, if I'm permitted. But it relates, and I have a sense of why the question I'm asking might be, you know, have its own problems. But I'm thinking about it again in terms of the assumption that some people think privacy is just so important, and others are like, even at an intuition level, I have nothing to hide. I don't care if the government spies on me or whatever. That again, it increases my sense of safety or security, and it's all good. And the reason why I say I see the problems is because, if you're a vulnerable population, you're targeted, there's concerns in terms of the privilege that someone might have to make them feel like that. But the reason why I'm bringing it up is, again, it seems like a counterintuition, as opposed to, creepiness being an intuition that, or an emotional response that's like, oh, I don't like that. And then someone else's emotional response might be, yeah, I don't see why that's wrong, which again kind of brings perhaps a different worldview into our sense of what it is that is objectionable, I guess, to violations of privacy, if anything. In which case, I might see someone making the argument that perhaps it's not even a problem at all for self-determination, insofar as, self-determination is primarily, like you said, socially located, I guess, or developed within these social, with the social relations that we create. So anyway, that's I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that counter emotional response.
Well, let's make sure that I tracked it correctly. Is the concern primarily about the sorry,
Yeah, sorry, I'll rephrase
sure.
it.
Yeah.
So it's really about, I guess, me thinking in terms of the subjectivity of the experience of feeling a creepiness as an emotional response, and how some people might not feel it. And
Yeah.
so since it is subjective to a great extent, again, like, this is kind of reiterate in a different way this idea that there might be an ontological assumption there involved in how different people view the world and experience whether something is creepy or not. And if there is that fundamental clash, then I wonder what that does to our conceptions of privacy as being so important for self-determination. Or
Yeah, good. So here's one of the things that I would want to say for sure, which is part of the longer paper that this talk is associated with, which is there's something that is involved in not simply like deferring to a person's subjective response of, say, creepiness. Again, like, I think we have to check our work, and part of that checking our work is by talking to others whose judgment that we think is wise or well, like, or fits the world in lots of ways. But the other thing that I think really matters here is a point that I borrow from standpoint epistemology, which is the thought that not everybody is an epistemic peer in the same kinds of ways. And some kinds of experience are going to make somebody better able to talk adeptly and understand adeptly what's going on in a certain situation than a person who doesn't have that kind of experience. So, for example, I haven't lived in the world as a boy or a man, and so I would always trust the body of experiences that are presented to me by folks who have, over whatever assemblage of conceptions that I put together myself. And I think we need to offer the same for other people, particularly people who are in positions of personal or social vulnerability. And that's where we don't just say, oh, my subjective perception of this situation is just as good as anybody else's subjective perception in that case. In some cases, people have either have a certain kind of authority because they will have seen the world through a different set of lenses that make them better equipped to say, in fact, this technology is in fact very very problematic in this particular kind of way. And so that's one of the reasons why I think, again, going back to like this participatory model of design that I alluded to earlier in the Q&A, I think it's always going to make our work better if we are listening to folks who have better kinds of experiences for evaluating a certain kind of setup or situation, and not simply trusting to my own first personal experiences, at least not solely.
Great, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to, well, I'll say thank you now, but Steve's going to close out the talk. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bhardwaj, for helping us understand creepy technology, what it means and what it means to us, and maybe how thinking in this way we can have a more ethical and also tech-savvy society. Really enjoyed the discussion. And I want to thank Dr. Kissel for moderating our discussion so expertly, and of course, all the participants for being here and engaging and offering such great questions. I think we really teased this point out very nicely with their contributions. So as always, a recording of this presentation will be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can view it again or share it with others. And there you can also find links to past talks and information on upcoming presentations in Ethically Speaking. But today is actually our last event for the spring semester, so I just want to tell you to hang out and be patient. We'll restart in the fall with a new series of topics and discussions, but you can help us develop that lineup. All who are attending, please email us at the UCF Center for Ethics if you have a topic that you'd like us to explore on ethics or contemporary moral issues. And feel free to suggest some speakers. We'll try to bring that topic and maybe that person to our series. So I'm going to share slides so that I can promote our friends who help make this happen. Our series here is made possible, obviously, with support from a lot of folks, and also the National Science Foundation, and our partners are here on the list. I really thank them for helping bring this series to you. And again, I just want to thank you for your participation, and I hope you'll join us for future presentations in Ethically Speaking.